on the YouTube. Preparing to live stream the webinar. Tick, 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 tick. We're all good in the chat, by the way. Although this has been available to sign up for about a month now, people are deciding 5 minutes before en masse is the time to try to log into the website and join, which is what it is.
The time
so
like the
for those of you who are organizing have made it in, can you please check your DMs to make sure there aren't members who are trying to get in? Just give me a minute where I'm vamping. I'm vamping, waiting to make sure that we're all good on the YouTube. Oh, there's Austin. So I think we are. That's amazing. We're all good in the chat, by the way. There we go. I can get rid of that. It's that manual step that gives the whole game away. Anyway, Austin, hello.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Oh, wait. I can't hear you, but you aren't muted.
Okay, test. Saying thing.
I can see the mouth moving.
Words.
You can hear? Oh, you can all hear him. We can see and hear both. Okay, so it's my audio. That's fine. Let me
cool.
just check that. So US preferences, bear with. USB audio device. Okay, can you speak again, Austin?
Test words, example words that are examples of noise making.
Nope. So I can hear you talking and my speaker works. So I'm going to switch off the video and mute and go find my headphones, and I'll do it that way. All right, so I've got the cans plugged into the laptop. Talk again and I'll see if I can hear you.
Test words for Gordon.
Nope. What the actual fuck? So people can't log in, and now I can't hear anything, and I've moved from speakers to headphones, and that's crazy. All right, let me keep talking, and I will see what I can.
Okay, I'll just keep talking. One of the
change my audio settings into that's what I'm doing.
So just continuing onward, Mercury is very close to retrograde right now.
No, I can't hear anything.
For those of you who are more,
and everyone else can.
Astrological.
This is very frustrating. All right, I'll be back in a minute.
So, for those of you who are astrologically minded and are curious why we might have chosen a time close to Mercury's retrograde station to talk, look at the rest of June, and that's the answer. You know, choosing times, right? Timing in general is always relative. There's very rarely a right answer and a wrong answer. There are like 30 wrong answers and some that, you know, might work. Oh, and so there's a question: did I bother to try to find, for example, rising that worked for both West Coast United States, where I am, and Tasmania? Like, no, it's so much of a headache for minimal gain. When I'm doing something like this, I usually pick based on moon and a lot of times planetary day, and whatever if there are other configurations that are really tight and about to complete. I look for the things that stay the same, that are the same for everywhere on Earth. If I can, I try to sneak myself a planetary hour that I would prefer. This one is Mercury, but there's not a lot to choose from. You'll note that we have a nice moon in Taurus, and Gordon and I actually agreed on the moon in early Taurus moving from the square to Saturn into the conjunction with Uranus, um, because in a sense, it emphasizes some of the dynamics of Q2 2020, and it actually is it's that Saturn Uranus square, which is sort of the seed for 2021 and 22, and the moon is exalted in Taurus and can kind of take the heat. But there are a couple different things, but that was one of them. But it's always a like best of limited options for something like this, right? Because this has to be second half of the month. I don't get to, we can't wait until that nice period in early August to elect things for a or a H2 talk.
Austin, I'm going to make you host so that we don't crash the video, and then
Okay.
I'm going to leave and talk amongst yourselves.
Okay. Goodbye, Gordon. All right. So now I have the one ring of hosting power. How's Kate? Kate is bottling in the warehouse. I believe that she's on the call from her phone. Yep, Kate is a powerhouse. Kate has been a powerhouse. Y'all just didn't know. Let's see. It's a good question, Ted. Whether Kate's, we'd have to probably ship Kate to Tasmania to get the machine spirits to favor Gordon, though. Will Mars and Aries mess the scene up further? Short answer, yes, and we're definitely going to talk about it.
I think I heard you breathing. Can you say something again? Ooh,
breathing. Okay. Yeah. Was it breathy?
It is. All right. It's always something. I just need to make sure. Yeah, it says live and custom streaming services. That's good. Sorry about the delay, everyone. But you know what? People couldn't log into the site, so maybe it helped. They see we've got an extra 40 or so people, but I don't think I need the cans anymore. Good. All right, Austin.
Hey.
Hello. How you doing?
I'm all right. Yeah. I am not super looking forward to talking about all this, which has been my experience of talking about astrology in 2020, which began in, I don't know, I think November of last year. I was like, I don't want to talk about this.
Yeah.
Like, I don't.
This is either going to be like, this is either going to be a really short episode or a really long episode. Because, yeah, the TLDR for the H2 2020 is that it's worse than H1. So it's going to be a challenging chat, but a necessary one. And I think it was even before November, right? Because we were kind of doing our planning for the stuff we want to talk about. And
yeah.
we kind of threaded it the whole way back to Portland in particular. So there's a sort of long running examination of this particular moment that I think is the backstory for people there.
Yeah, I would say in Portland more than I realized at the time. The subject of our conversation was a set of changes that we knew were coming up, and they were definitely the story of getting into the next decade. And then why I picked November was by that time I'd done my year homework, and I had to go on the astrology podcast with Chris and Kelly and talk about it all blow for blow. And it was the realizing that some of the topics, the changes that we talked about months earlier were actually not in the medium term, but we're gonna like start in 6 weeks or 2 months.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been an ongoing process of losing all excitement for my chosen profession.
For the people who are panicking about the record button, it is streaming live to YouTube, so don't worry. It's all good. All right, so with that in mind, there's a few kind of places we can go back to. Portland is one of them, and I think when we talk about this moment in the wider context of, or the longer cycle, we can come back to that. But as we always do with these half-yearly checkups, let's look backwards. Let's look backwards at how we did and what I guess the configuration of the match was for, in your opinion, for H1.
Well, I mean, we said a bunch of stuff. I'm sure we could nitpick some errors here and there. I feel that the tone provided was certainly exactly right. The thing that I go to when I think about our H1 conversation was actually a question at the end. When someone, I forget who it was, and I forget exactly what the question was, but they're basically like, so what do we do about this? What's the best time to move? And I remember sort of droning / ranting into this sort of extended metaphor about how maybe this wasn't the time to go after your dreams. And then I think I had a pretty good sort of metaphor save about how, you know, dreams are like they're like the little seeds that you maybe you don't throw them away just because you can't plant them now, but you carry them until you get to better soil. In my mind, that's synonymous with like carrying coals. You know, a lot of cultures that don't have like instant fire making tech will save some coals from each fire, and this sense of like carrying the coals. And I felt really weird about that answer at the time because I don't ever want to be like, hey, fuck your dreams. That's impossible. That's not really, it's not my attitude towards life. And it's certainly not something I want to encourage. But I felt like that was the move at the beginning of the year. And I feel quote unquote better / worse about saying that now.
Yeah, so a very good case can be made for Jupiter and Capricorn being configuration of the half for that reason, right? Because it was either in H1 or in Portland where the difference between Jupiter Sag and Jupiter Cap was that it isn't a time to expand your business. You don't have the kind of you don't have good wins in sales and the sort of forgiving conditions for businesses that might not be fully formed yet. It's a consolidation phase, and there are, like, if you had started your business at the beginning of the year, you literally were not able to trade for most of this half. So it's like that contraction of trade, like it's very specifically like a no. It's a very specific from expansive to shutdown and consolidation, and literally working out on an individual or business basis what survival looks like. Like it's actually how much is left in the tank and how far can it get me. And so a case can be made, I think, for Jupiter Cap being configuration of the half.
Well, so yes, and so we went from, so there are two things that make a planet strong in a sense, maybe more than two, but there are two that we can isolate very easily. One is simply its position. Is it in a part of the sky that amplifies its strength or supports its strength? Jupiter is very strong and sad for that reason. Or is it in a hard piece of terrain relative to that planet's function, Jupiter and Cap? The second thing is, are there other planets which are in a position to interfere with it or support it? Right. So we have, just as in life, we have both positional and relational factors. And Jupiter, Jupiter from the end of last year through the first part of this year, sort of flipped in both of those. It went from a strong position to a weak position, and it went from being unimpeded to being maximally impeded. Right. Some like the language I've used for that, which is a translation of a term used in Prussia, is cursed, but not by an evil wizard, but like maximally impeded, being crossed or cursed, right? And so we have weak Jupiter. We've had weak Jupiter cursed or crossed for a lot of this year, and one of the on the ground observational takeaways from Jupiter in that position is that it's unable to help. Jupiter plays this role of help or luck or protection. I was joking the other day with you, I think, Gordon, as well as somebody I was talking to before that, about how when Jupiter is strong, it kind of bubble wraps things. So even if they take a hit, it's not so bad, right? Even if they're made of glass and they take a hit, if they're bubble wrapped, maybe there's no breakage. And so a big part of 2020 has been that we're all out of bubble wrap. And so there are problems certainly that emerged. And, at least half of the issue was that the either protective or reparative response to those was non-existent or complete failure. Right.
Yeah. Just thinking of other options for, crowning configuration of the half. I think there are several. What was it that happened around Armstrong's January 18th turning point? It was the same week. Something Uranus, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, we had a bunch of stuff within that week. That was the Saturn Pluto conjunction being perfect while the sun was on top it, while there was a lunar eclipse exactly opposite, and that was like 5-6 days earlier. So that was a node of
that
doom.
Was a mess.
If I was going to give a configuration of the half, absolutely goes to Mars, Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter, all conjoined in the same sign as the south node. Basically, that loosely went from mid February to mid April, but with the exactitude more March, end of March. But that was the combination of basically two very long cycles that are not necessarily positive, that were then set on fire by Mars, which is quicker. And so that was the everything at once configuration. And we're kind of going to, in a sense, be referencing that configuration in a couple different ways during the second half, because those big long cycles are not over yet, and Mars will intersect with that again, but from literally a different angle.
The other one that I think is interesting, and this is as we start to look at trying to frame this conversation, which is going to be challenging or stark anyway, in a way that is beneficial or medicinal, is looking for bits of good news. And so one of them, I think, is the sort of Saturn in Aquarius preview, and literally like an aerosolized malefic. And as far as I can tell, one of the good things we can sort of say at this point in 2020 is the moment has chosen its weapons, right? Like we know broadly, certainly not in combination. There's predictability and there's predictability, right? Right. The moment has kind of chosen the things that it's going to use when it comes to misfortune. I think, would that be a fair thing to say? Do you suppose?
Yeah, the way that the way that I've been thinking about it, and be reflected in my little scrolled notes, is that the a lot of the cards have been turned over. The game is like, we're not done with the game, but we know what some of those cards are, and it was actually your choice of the horseman silhouettes for this discussion
Yeah.
that got me thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
Which that wasn't, by the way, for listeners, viewers, that wasn't like the result of a conversation. Gordon almost never tells me what the image is going to be, so it's always a fun surprise, and I think that was very appropriate. And we know some of their identities now,
Yes.
and we can see when those cards are in play again during the second half of the year, but they're not new cards. It's another hand in the same game.
Yeah, this is it's a point in any battle where the enemy, such as it is, although that's an oversimplification, has you inevitably have to show your hand or show your army. Like,
Mhm.
and so we know what's ahead of us. It doesn't make it good. It's not going to be pleasant, but at least it's visible. And
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
you can adapt to hostile knowns much better than you can adapt to probably hostile unknowns.
yes. Yeah. So before we there's actually still a few dregs left in H1 that I think, as they're looming, we should talk about. In particular, the eclipses, and the one that's coming up, that will have me hiding under a pile of coats praying the rosary. I think we should
Yeah.
start with that one.
Yeah. So in my thinking, we kind of start H2 about 2 weeks early, maybe about 2 weeks early, because there are several lineup changes that all occur during the second half of June, many of which really properly begin the whole second half of the year. And I will say, it's worth noting that in my thinking about the year, I saw three primary stress points, and those being times where there were multiple difficult things all entangled at the, in all playing in the same sandbox at the same time, right? Because it's not, just as in human life, when we're looking at what is most difficult in astrology, we're looking at when problems intersect in a way that it makes it impossible to solve any one, because there are these two others right here, right?
Mm.
And that was exactly what we had during especially March. um and so the second sort of, I don't know, shit point, for lack of more descriptive language, is end of June, early July, and then we'll get to it. And then the third point will be September. So what happens during the why I speak negatively about the end of June, early July, is we get a total solar or an annular solar eclipse, which is that's when you get to see the little golden ring. If you're looking at it, it's a very intense eclipse, and the more visually intense the eclipse, that means the more perfect an eclipse it is, the more shade it is literally throwing. So there's that. We have a Mercury retrograde, which starts in a few days from now. That'll be running during that eclipse and into through most of the first half of July. And then we have two other factors. One of which is Saturn moves back from Aquarius, where it's been since just after the equinox, so just about a quarter. Saturn moves back into Capricorn, and Mars moves into Aries. um and so all of this during that, end of June, first part of July, is a lot. And I expect that we will see another wave of difficulties, probably primarily economic, but things are really entangled right now. um
That's one of the through
so
lines. I think it's almost like it's almost wicked problems, right? Where you can't unpick one of them for long enough to fix the other. It's deeply grown in together.
so one of those that I think is probably worth picking out at least, we can at least pick out the motion of one planet, right? Is Saturn. Because Saturn, if we're going to kind of, if we're going to try to reduce the scope of what we're looking at, Saturn should probably be the one thing, if there's going to be one thing. And so Saturn moves relatively slowly. It's about 2.5 years per sign. And this year, Saturn is back and forth between two signs. It was in Capricorn until the end of March, and then it popped into Aquarius, and it's about to pop back out. That 3 months in Aquarius is going to be, that's where Saturn's going to be for all of 21, all of 22, and the first chunk of 23. So that is a preview. Saturn's movement back into Capricorn, where it will be until the very end of 2020, is sort of a like back to the last several years. Most importantly, Saturn moving back into Capricorn is Saturn rejoining Pluto. And the Saturn Pluto conjunction is, again, if we're looking at sort of simple single things that best describe the difficulties that we've already encountered this year, it's the Saturn Pluto. It is as documented extensively by Richard Tarnas well before any of this happened. It's a period of totalitarian social organization. There are periods of fear and division. There are also periods where we see not only that sort of plague of that type of thinking, but we also see literal diseases. The last couple, AIDS, polio, what became the Spanish flu, et cetera, et cetera. It's an ugly configuration, at least for the humans. And so we're going to have Saturn and Pluto back right next to each other for the rest of the year until January. And so it's that particular conjunction then gets stimulated or irritated by quicker moving cycles and things. But that's really, if we're looking for a chief villain, or at least the signature that describes very well and times our difficulties, it's that one.
Yeah. It's interesting. So most people who are watching this would know that Armstrong's plague cycle peaks at the end of next year. So it's just very interesting that we got our Saturn Aquarius preview, and that was the story of it. But it is actually worse as we move further into what we might as well start calling now the actual age of Aquarius that's that's coming up. I think that's a really useful bookend for how we think about H2, though, which is, well, SatCap we kind of know what that is, for better and for worse. It's a showing of its hand, and you just kind of think there's a presidential election coming up. Arguably, SatCap has been defined by this presidency. There's a whole bunch of things that I think promote visibility in that sense.
Yeah, it's yeah, I think there are a lot of I think a lot of the difficulties that are anchored to that configuration are pretty clear at this point. And so here's the good news. That Saturn Pluto thing, like, we've got about 6 months left of that, a little under 6 months left. That doesn't go, like, we don't get them in the same sign or conjoined again for many decades. Right? So it unpicks that. Now, one thing to consider, right, is part of what we're doing with these conjunctions, right, is in a sense we're timing the arrival or ingress of something, right, of a set of patterns. Now, for example, if my house gets demolished by, I don't know, by ogres, right? Like giant 8-foot beings come in and just smash my house, and we can time the arrival of the ogres. And then the ogres fuck up my house for, let's say, 1 month. That my house isn't rebuilt the second that the ogres leave.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's an important timing thing, just because there is no longer a stress anymore after a given period of time, that means that that is no longer active. It means that if I try to, like, I don't know, put my stairs back together, they won't get smashed again, right, the next day. But there's still all of that rebuilding work has to be done. The lack of a negative input isn't a positive input.
Correct. Whew. For H2, do we want to talk about early September, or do we want to talk about Mars? What's next?
Well, so let's talk about, so yeah, like, so again, part of the reason why end of June, early July is important is we kind of see there's a little bit of a places everyone, because Saturn moves back into Cap. That's where it's going to be until mid-December, right? Mars moves into Aries, and usually Mars takes 5-6 weeks to do a sign. During the during the periods around Mars's retrogrades, slows way the fuck down, and so we're going to have Mars in Aries for over 6 months. Mars won't leave Aries until January, right? So we've got basically these two about 6 month, right? H2 long influences, which start up by the beginning of July. And so from a tactical point of view, this is a really good time to start looking at it, right? And be like, okay, what are these? There's the question of like, oh, what does this mean for the world? But I don't know. World watching feels a little bit less valuable than ever, and a little bit more in personally corrosive than ever. That may be my experience, or the experience of a limited number of people. But you can also see those on a personal level, right?
Sure.
Like
Well, I
Mars
think
moving to
there's
Aries
a
will be
limited,
my 10th house, which is different than where it's been. So I'm going to
yeah,
look at different things for me.
yeah. There's limited uplift in continually watching the world. It's the places everyone affect, right? Like we kind of, how much more benefit are you going to derive from watching the world when you know what's in play? Like it's just negatively impacting you beyond a certain point, right?
Yeah,
So
and also
yes,
even if you're a very, how should we say, active in the world person with a lot of influence, there is still a sweet spot of how much attention do you pay to things that allows you to more accurately or effectively help whatever part of the world, right? And then you can always go over that even if that threshold is very high. And I feel
yes,
like it's very easy to go over that right now.
yeah,
So Mars, right? So Mars is very strong in Aries in terms of the positional strength, like Jupiter is strong in Sagittarius. Mars in Aries is very strong. Aries is a fire sign. It is cardinal, meaning it has initiatory, beginning, inflammatory, initiatory, igniting kind of energy. And so this is just fine with Mars. And so this is it's a fire starter. And Mars is our planet of of literal inflammation in terms of setting things on fire, of bodily inflammation, both in a negative sense of like, oh, I ate a bunch of pesticide laced food and now I'm inflamed, but also positive inflammation. Like when you once you've done your warm up and your body starts feeling good and warm and your heart is beating and you literally perform better, right? Mars is the like get fired up in all of those senses. And then socially, it's inflammatory as well. Mars is if Venus brings connection between people or shows common ground, Mars shows what ground can't be shared, right? Where the fault lines in relationship are. And so having Mars very strong for 6 months, I think one of the analogies I used on a podcast was it's kind of like it's sort of raining gasoline for a while. And if you're careful about gathering that and using that petrol to fuel your vehicles, then that might be a positive thing because you were very thoughtful. In terms of, casually smoking, it has potentially negative implications. And the issue is that Mars in Aries and Saturn in Capricorn end up intersecting pretty much perfectly, a perfect 90-degree angle, in September. And it's actually at that time that Mars is moving the slowest. That's when we have the retrograde station, right? Which is where the motion of Mars through our sky from Earth ceases and then moves in the slowest possible way. We're talking about 10 times slower than normal. And so that's just Mars sitting basically at that 90 degrees to Saturn. And so in traditional astrology, so with Mars and Saturn they're not always the culprits, but they're kind of the two bads, where if there's something going wrong, we should probably interview them first, right? And Mars is hot bad and Saturn is cold bad, right? Saturn is it's too cold. It's too slow. My freedom is restricted. I can't move, right? It's a limitation of motion and energy, or depression of those. And then Mars is it's too hot. I can't keep going. I'm exhausted. I'm pissed off emotionally, right? Mars would be like anger or rage. And then Saturn would be depression, right? And so when you have them both fighting, that you tend to get quite negative events. And so they're basically they're locked in combat more or less for all of September. And it's not just Mars and Saturn, it's Saturn with Pluto. So we have this, how should we say, if anything, historically, Saturn Pluto is shown to exaggerate the wall building function of Saturn, which can be healthy and architectural and useful. But the Saturn Pluto conjunctions very often, or almost universally, show that function exaggerated to the point of, Berlin walls, of like armed guards, of, razor wire, that kind of feeling and imagery. And so that, Mars versus that is, there's not a lot of, how should we say, there's not a lot of slack or bubble wrap there.
Mm. And Mars retrograde in Aries isn't just starting fires, it's like wanton starting fires, isn't it? So we're sort of looking at, again, the good news is this moment has chosen its weapons. So it's safe to assume further widespread house arrest and also civil unrest, right? Like Armstrong's model's been predicting this election to be the most violent since the 60s. And he's been predicting that for 15 years.
I don't see how that couldn't be true.
Yeah. And you look at
I remember looking at the astrology last year and just being like, oh, it's going to be the worst election ever, which is a pretty easy guess. But I was like, oh, how could it be anything else?
Yeah. And I want to kind of poke in on that a little bit more, because it's not, if you guys even get an election this year, no one's going to believe it. And what's interesting is when I look at Socrates, or the stuff that he's put out on the private blog, right? The one election that Socrates got quote unquote wrong was Bush-Gore, because Socrates said that Gore would win. And the thing is, he did. So even when it was wrong, it was right. And this time it's got Trump narrowly winning. However, it doesn't have Trump running a full term. And in fact, around February of next year is one of the places where it could in fact end. Now that's interesting. That means either delayed election, that means maybe they'll pick something that he's actually done that is an actual crime to go after him for, because that'd be fucking great. It could be anything, but it's not. Like, if you look at H2, particularly from an American perspective, we know it's going to be civil unrest, and even if it's justifiable, and it is, like the protesting is justifiable, you're still going to get on the far right and the far left, agents provocateurs, you're going to get violence in with what is legitimate unrest. And that's just T, like
Yes.
that's what we're looking at for H2.
Well, and that relates to, I don't know, I think it was a conversation we were having about 2 weeks ago about this conversation. And I was saying that one of the things if I go back in time and change about what I already said about the year, was that I think I got a lot of the shapes right. I think I didn't do great on the first half of June. But I got a lot of shapes right. But I was sort of interpreting them as if they would manifest in the normal human realm. Whereas if I had assumed like the hell realm shape of everything, I would have been dead on. And so, in terms of like macro expectations, assuming the shittier version of everything that still matches the shape archetypally, um and so that was one of the reframes that suggested to me was with Mars, and what I've said about, because I've narrated what Mars retrogrades are like and what that feels like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 times publicly now, is that usually one of the things that I bring up, and this is relevant on a personal level, is like, oh, what is the value of anger? What is worth fighting over? And if it's worth fighting over, how do you talk about it, right? The Mars retrograde brings Mars things into question, right? What is and that'll come up for lots of people on an individual level, and that's a right and good thing to interrogate at that every 2 years interval. I think that on a more collective level, if we're doing the hell realm interpretation, it's going to be, what is the value of violence, right? And that those questions will be about Mars enacted in an uncomfortably literal, what is the value of setting things on fire, right? And not, rather than like, oh, what about anger and internal states?
I've just lost your audio again. So interesting. Like you just went silent. Do you want to keep talking and we'll see what happens?
Sure.
Yeah, no, you've gone. I'll be back in a sec. Well, keep talking about that, because what I wanted to say was, how does that, we need to find the positive, weird way of saying it. What does that look like on a personal or on a human scale, right? So we've been talking, for me, in July, I was going to do it anyway, dry July, and like increasing cardio because of where the Mars and Aries action starts on the chart. So while I fix my audio, if you want to chat to the kids about that.
Okay, yeah. And so this brings up a really important question, or a very important issue generally in astrology, but I would say especially during a difficult year like this, which is understanding that the collective and the individual are not identical, but they are related, right? And we can't say that they're totally distinct. But for example, I live in the United States. The United States can have an absolute shit year, but there will certainly be individual Americans who have great years or mediocre years or equally bad years, et cetera, et cetera. And so even though we can we can see a lot of configurations happening on both the sort of macro as well as the micro, we have different choices to make on an individual level, right? And so, one of the questions is, what do you do when it's raining gasoline all the time, right, for 6 months? What do you do when there's an excess of martial energy? And those answers will be, the best answers will have variance across individuals depending on where it's hitting their chart, what your health situation is, et cetera, et cetera. But planning to intentionally intersect with that is worth doing. And I will say also, even though we've been talking about Mars as this 6-month thing, we've got kind of until like middle of August to live with Mars and Aries and get a feel for it before we enter the entangled malefics period. And so Mars retrogrades don't sneak up. It'll brew for a solid 2 months before it actually happens. And so part of that is looking at how am I responding to the how should the increase of astral fire in my life. Am I, am I snapping at the people I don't want to be? Is this showing up health wise? Is this showing up in relationships? Is it showing up in my thinking? And so you've got about 2-ish months to get to know that before we hit that entangled shit show period in September.
Nice one. It appears if I leave Zoom and come back, I can hear you again. This is just very frustrating. It's all good. However, the questions in the Q&A have disappeared from me. Can you see them?
Oh, probably. Let me see.
Do you click on Q&A? Because you haven't left.
Do I need to upgrade you to a panelist?
No, don't, definitely don't. Because but if you just click
you don't
on
want
the
me
Q&A
fucking
button,
with the buttons here.
Well, no, because
there was a question. So a couple people asked, or one person asked, what is dry July, Gordon?
oh, right. So that's an Australian thing, kind of like November, where you just don't drink booze for a month. And it's midwinter here. And usually I'm traveling. I was supposed to be in New York, so I never get to do it. But dry July is just like taking a month off the sauce when there's nothing going on. James can see the questions. That's good. Okay, cool. Because they reset for me. So when it comes to the Q&A section, James, I'm going to need them posted in a document for me. So cool. Because there's one open question from Shannon, but I didn't see the 7 or 8 before it. Great. All right. So I came back into talking about the difference between Mars and Mars retrograde. Is there anything else? Like, do we want to? It's funny. It's some of these configurations, and when we're talking about the dramas of H2, extend into Q1 of 2021, right? Like, there's the
Kinda.
yeah, there's a Saturn Uranus square that I think is going to be interesting from
the Saturn Uranus is that's years that extends at least 21 and 22, and we're actually kind of we're going back to Saturn Pluto. It won't be until we get to next year that we're really back in Saturn Uranus, and then Saturn Uranus is just going to be, that'll be our H1 2021, our H2, our H1 the next year, and our H2. And so and we got a preview of that during the second quarter of this year. So Saturn, Pluto, and it's interesting because you can see how they relate in practice, but in the geometry of the planet's movements, they're actually quite distinct. So Saturn, Pluto is, it's the super lockdown, right? And this time it looked like a plague lockdown, but in the past it's always looked like lockdowns, but for different reasons, right? Again, Pluto sort of exaggerates the Saturnian containment function. Saturn square Uranus always looks like Saturn, which is control, security, safety, containment, contrasted with Uranus, which is revolutionary zeal, the willingness to break from the norm. Uranus is it's the either heroic or villainous Lucifer, right, from Milton. It's Prometheus. Like, were they right? I don't know, but they definitely broke with with whatever they were supposed to do. And so Saturn and Uranus have essentially opposed characteristics. And then when they're at a hard angle in the sky, we get a lot of disruption. And so we got a peak of that during the Q2 of this year. And you could see, like, there were lockdown protests. There were also the more recent protests, outraged over George Floyd's death and the associated historical and present day difficulties. But what's interesting from an astrology point of view is it's revolt time with Saturn and Uranus. And we saw revolts in the United States that could easily be classed into both left and right. But the astrology just says, oh, it's time to say, fuck these rules. Right.
Yeah.
And so we've got that for years.
It's just interesting to me that as you say, it was sort of second quarter of the first half that we got a little wink at it. But one of the things we've spoken about for Uranus and Taurus is food, right? And so if you look, it was hoarding, but it was also a reconfiguration on a dime So very Uranian of an American food supply system, which, for instance, 40% of all food prior to the lockdowns in America was consumed in restaurants. You close them and you get a disruption, but an instant reconfiguring. So I'm obviously plugged into regenerative agriculture down here and to some extent across the world. And it was something Joel Salatin said on Rogan, right, which was that people who are in his world, so regenerative ag and direct from farmer businesses, like from a food perspective and veg boxes and all the rest of it, did 2.5 times their average business during it. So that's very interesting to me, that that's going to be one of the defining stories. It was always going to be. Uranus and Taurus was going to be about a bunch of things, but a reconfiguration of the food supply. And we've spoken about it as the sort of modified pea protein fake meat thing, which is definitely there. But it's this is just pure Uranian, and it's as a result of a kind of like aerosolized Saturn. So it's sort of like you have the emerging surveillance state, and you have a kind of pivot to like authenticity as expressed in something like food, and we got a hint of it, and then it's going to define, that's going to be a tension for the medium term.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's if we look at, I did a talk on Uranus and Taurus. I think it was the first day that it ingressed in 2018. I did a talk that's I think it's available on my website. I don't know. I recorded it. It should be. But one of the things that I that I found historically was, again, big sudden and radical changes having to do with food supply. On a positive level, you also have some of the most beloved foods of the contemporary age being invented. Like chocolate chip cookies were invented during Uranus and Taurus.
Cool.
Potato chips were invented, but like that, like with Uranus, you have, how should we say, the whatever the norm is in that area is subject to extremely high volatility, both in terms of, we could say, what we could call a positive disruption, like, hey, here's this new food everyone loves, as well as negative disruptions, right? Like, well, no, who do we sell this food to that 40% of which was bought by restaurants before, right?
Yes. Yeah. And that was a perfect Uranian unpredictability, because there were shortages which spiked, say, beef prices initially, and then they were about 40% lower, because the inertia of the system meant that the beef producers were still getting, and in particular premium cuts, ready for a market that wasn't there, but you couldn't actually stop that. So there was a couple of weeks where you could get prime cuts for well and truly below what they were even before any of this had happened. And you just look and go, it's literally a bull. It's literally like exotic bull.
That's really funny. I wasn't tracking the market conditions of that, but I do remember, I don't know, a couple months ago going to the store and looking at the fresh beef section and being like, holy shit, that's a good price. And stocking up on some beef. And then coming back like 2 weeks later and being like, wasn't this like half as much?
That's exactly what happened in the US. Yeah. Particularly for prime cuts.
Yeah. And so there is one, should I say, there are many things there, but one of them is just like a quick lesson on Uranus and why it probably doesn't fit into the traditional categories of malefic or benefic. It just brings volatility, which can be, for a given actor or person, crazy good. Like if you happen to be at the beef store during the oversupply of beef, or it can be crazy bad, but what it reliably does is brings volatility, which is that good or bad, position and relation.
I think, and it's one of the examples of this moment choosing its weapons or showing its hands, right? So it's not just going to be food, it's commodities in general. And this whole process has begun an inflationary uptrend that, as far as I can tell, it's going to go to 2024. So and I think it's going to be this is Armstrong's guess anyway, that it's the scarcity-based inflation, which is what we just saw. So it's literally volatility. It's the unreliability of a previously reliable food supply chain means that things cost more and there are shortages, and it does this. It's not shortages in a endless famine sense, but in a I can't find it, if you see it, buy it kind of situation. And that appears to have just kind of selected what it's going to do.
Yeah, well, and that intersects with the other classic Uranus and Taurus thing, which is historically lots of extreme weather stuff in all directions. Again, to like take whatever the expectation is and volatilize it,
Yeah.
right? And even though too cold and too warm are a problem, if it's consistent and you can rely on it being too warm or too cold, there are ways to plan around that. But if you're planning for too cold and it's crazy hot, or if you're planning for the opposite, and that's disrupted, then what you planted, maybe you planted that which survives heat and it's cold, or the reverse. And so that's also classic Uranus and Taurus, in addition to some of the more I should say that is like a boring in the moment, like, oh, it's hotter out than I thought it would be, sort of thing that is nonetheless has a big impact on prices, like you were saying.
Yeah. So H2, because I want to talk about Aquarius, which bleeds into next year, and that is itself nested in our longer triplicity discussion. But H2 is very much the story of the bad guys. Is there anything else from the good guys that's worth looking at? Not really. Jupiter at the end of the year.
Well, Jupiter, I mean, the best thing about H2 is that Saturn and Jupiter both change signs in mid-December, which pulls us out of what we've been doing. We're going to be doing Mars with Saturn and Pluto for the second half of the year, which we already got a lot during the first quarter of this year, and it fucking sucked. And so there's more of that. But the nice thing is that ends, and then we are not delivered unto the heaven realm, but we're out of this Saturn Pluto mess by then.
Yes.
Couple ways of thinking about it. One, in back to our earlier discussion about sort of turning over cards and choosing weapons. I think that we'll have the cards will all be turned over by the end of the year. And it's almost like it's a little bit of a like floor from here's where we're working from this decade, right?
Yeah.
These are all of the problems that are going to need to be solved. I don't think we're going to have the introduction of radically new problems to solve next year. I think it will be the difficulties of solving the problems that are already mostly revealed in 2020.
Yeah.
So I had let me just share this. So this is literally dream logic. So the other day, I've been thinking a lot about how to talk about the second half of the year. And I sort of like half woke up and then stayed in that half sleep state for a while, for a couple hours, day before yesterday. And I had this really clear vision / understanding about the second half of the year, which when I translated it into words wasn't very impressive, but I will share it. And in the dream, there was this like sense of looking at timelines and seeing that there were traps at various point in time, right? Like I remember like kind of my mind scanning over the Saturn or the Uranus Pluto squares and the Saturn Uranus opposition before that. But then in the dream, there's the message, if there was one, was simply that 2020 didn't contain traps, that it was a trap, that like that was the nature of those configurations, as contrasted with others which were dangerous but not inherently hostile to the human. And so that's obviously not literally true, but there's something there that I've been kind of picking apart in my mind.
Well, some of it might be this. I remember when we were last talking about the triplicity for H1, and you said, I wonder what the imperial land grab will be in like the triplicity of air, and I said it's going to be data, right? And if you look at again our Saturn in Aquarius preview, It is that. It's contact tracing. It's all the rest of it. Now, one of the inevitable things that's going to happen, it doesn't matter what you think about it, and honestly, fuck the police, but one of the things that will happen is a defund the police movement sets in, is engineering out costs by replacing it with this, all of a sudden, here's what I prepared earlier, contact tracing. So you can actually dramatically reduce how much you spend on policing by acquiescing to this control grid that has been built, right? So if you actually look at the story, there's a medium-term Aquarian theme. This is what I mean by the true age of Aquarius, that gets us over into that triplicity in a way. And it's the story of how these different things interface. So Jupiter in Aquarius is going to be two things. I think it's going to be the Euro monetary crisis at the end of next year, but it's the arrival of digital currency, right? And Saturn in Aquarius, we've got is an aerosolized boogeyman, but it is also data, right? It's also control and contestation of data. And so 2020 is a trap, right? But it's a trap that you don't, in a dream logic sense, that we're not necessarily stuck in. If we look at it and go, okay, the moment has picked its things, don't fall into what that trap is. And it's, that's the benefit of fortune telling. But this is kind of what I mean by talking about H2. Based on what you just said, which I think is valid, 2020 has revealed what the challenges are for the next 5 years, 10 years. They're not going to change in between commodities and access to healthy food and the tension with surveillance and so on. This is what they are. This is what they are. Same thing with digital currency and presumably
inflationary pressures due to volatile goods pricing. Yeah.
We know what they are. That's
it's a little Pandora's box. And it's a little like so just to pop back to something we've been talking about for years, is the Jupiter Saturn conjunction at the very end of this year is actually the anchor point for beginning a new 200-ish year period and ending a 200-ish year period. And it just so happens that this particular juncture point between these longer cycles has a bunch of other stuff going on with it. And so I think that the challenges, themes, et cetera, instead of like taking the first decade to unpack, we're all like spring loaded, right? Like those little like spring snakes. You open the box and then boom, right in your face. And so there's a little bit of a like spring loaded Pandora's box action in 2020. And the good thing about that is like, everything is right in our face and it's too much all at once to process effectively on a week by week basis. But things don't continue at this pace, right? There will be at the bottom of that, there will be Elpis, right? There will be okay, that's it. Here's hope, right? Which is how that the Pandora's box, it's really like Pandora's amphora or jug, but whatever, is a demon bottle. But the last one was hope because in part there weren't any others. And you're like, oh, well, that gives me hope. You mean this isn't endless, right? And 2020 isn't endless. And like that, and even if there wasn't a positive spirit, that would be cause for joy enough. Maybe there's a little wine left in the bottom there.
It's definitely worth, as you say, like focusing on. It's just there's no sugarcoating. It's quite shit until December, and then we get to slightly less shit, which is going to feel like the removal of chronic pain. And even if you're still not in the best physical condition, at least you're not in chronic pain. And
you're like, this chronic pain is so much better than the acute pain that I was in last month.
Yeah. And that's good. I mean, as I said, if I was ever going to pick the four horsemen image for the blog post, it was going to be for this half of this year out of all of the ones where we do this, because it's always the first one you think of, like, oh well, we're talking about portentous things, let's drop a four horsemen in. And I've always resisted, but if we were ever going to,
but you save that card.
Yeah. So even I have revealed my cards at this point, but right, anything else left in H2 or
Well, just a little bit on a little bit on rhythm, right? Because it's not just like the speakers are all the way up and blasting hellscape the entire time, right? There's rhythm and terrain. Um, so we have, we have this sort of difficulty spike end of June, first half of July. And then I really like end of July, first half of August on the 2020 sliding scale, right? This is a bell curve. I think that's actually a really, if you gotta like do something, like I don't know, like I've been trying to get the second edition of Faces out for a while, and that means I have to pick a publication date. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna do it then, right? End of August, and then certainly September, I would say, is probably max difficulty settings. And that is there's a lot of that has a lot in common with basically the second half of February and then March, configuration wise. We have Mars activating the Jupiter Saturn Pluto thing. Both March and September have that in common. It's a little bit different, but we have that in both cases. Um, and then just like with March, there were to speak almost humorously clinically, there were difficulties that emerged in March which were not gone in April, right? Nor were they gone in May. And so there are difficulties that are introduced in September that will not be gone in October. That wave sort of we get some kind of directional change in November. Mars goes direct. It's no longer tightly square Saturn and Pluto. We of course have a Mercury retrograde second half for a lot of October. Here's just on a sort of, I don't know, telling stories about an election to come. It's really interesting. There's a Mercury direct station basically on election day in the United States, which is interesting. But then, November, we get Mars stations direct, Mercury's direct, and then we have, as far as like the attack of the ogres from earlier, the ogres will no longer be smashing my windows, but the chimeras or whatever. I'm sorry, I play too many fantasy war games. But it doesn't mean that everything's fixed just because that, there's not a fresh wave of difficulties. And so what we do get between Mars's direct, Mercury's direct at during the first half of November, and the Jupiter Saturn ingress into Aquarius in the middle of December, right, which is sort of our like, okay, here's our new thing that we're going to do going forward. Our new thing will be trying to solve all of this or learn how to live with, et cetera, et cetera. But between that, we have a pair of eclipses. And the pair of eclipses that are at the very end of November and in early December of the second half of this year are they're in a new set of signs. We've been doing these eclipses in Cancer and Capricorn for almost 2 years now. And so we get our last set of Cancer Capricorn eclipses over the next couple weeks, right? Middle of 2020. But then our next set will be in Sagittarius and Gemini. And in terms of this sort of strong suspicion that you and I have, as well as I think a lot of people, that the results of the election will be contested on a potentially unprecedented level, or that there will, that there's going to be something going on there that is not historical norm.
I don't think
Our
either
first,
side will believe. I don't think either side
yeah,
will believe.
yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And we don't know exactly what it is, so it's hard to get more precise. But speaking to that, we have a lunar eclipse in Gemini at the end of November, and that eclipse takes that the lunar part of that takes place right next to one of the royal stars, which is Aldebaran, and meanwhile the sun is conjunct another royal star, which is Antares, and so the four royal stars. Those are both Bohemian stars. They're big in magic because they have big royal energy. And then when we're looking at them in a mundane fortune telling for the world perspective, they have to do with people who are in really big, powerful places, right? Powerful places of power. And so having an eclipse happen right next to the on top of two of those doesn't speak to the stability of power. And as I was saying to you the other day, eclipses are quite literally shady. They speak to
Yeah.
things that move just out of visibility. And so I think that's yet another sort of testimony towards not only an unpleasant election, but also results that are not, we don't just click into whoever the new thing is.
Yeah. Yeah. There's actually more in theory we could say about the eclipses in the election, but
Indeed.
yes, maybe save that for looking back. Yeah, looking back at the end of the year. Is there anything else for H2 before we hit the questions that we want to make sure? So we did the eclipses. We did it ending with moving from acute to chronic pain, and that's good news. Violence, probable lockdowns.
Yeah, and anger, both deeply justified as well as unjustified.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Mars loves it all.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Shit. So, anything else for H2, or do we want to hit some questions now?
Let's do questions, and that'll probably give us the opportunity to recontextualize some of the H2 stuff.
I think so. I'm going to jump around a bit here, and I'll do the ones that are open. And because remember, mine vanished. So if yours hasn't been said, paste it in again, or James will. But Delta Mark has a mundane astrology question, which I think is good. What do the next 6 months look like for India, China, given what just happened at the border?
I don't have a great answer. So the thing is, the Mars Saturn thing, the Mars Saturn Pluto thing, which I described, is obviously gets a front row seat in America. However, that's happening everywhere. And so, if I'm gonna, I wrote this little checklist of things for my 2020 piece that I cut from what I published. I cut like half of what I write. And it was just sort of like, will there be more military activity and violence during this period? Absolutely. Right. Like if we're looking for touch points, wherever there are touch points, that raining gasoline isn't going to help. I don't think we're going to have a great power war between India and China. But kind of wherever, with a few exceptions, wherever there are touch points like that, the 6 months of Mars in Aries is not going to help, or it is going to help, but in the way that Mars thinks of helping.
Yes, and crucially, it's at a border, right? So what you were talking about with walls, when we get back to SatCap, like it's literally a anger at a border, right?
Yeah, and so that's the archetype shape. One reason, by the way, that a lot of this is more American than a lot of than it is, or is how should we say, very visible in America, is because the United States was born with Pluto basically where it is now. And so Pluto on top of that, and Saturn on top of that, and Mars aggravating that, it's poking what is an American, what was an American natal problem, right? Which has been there the whole time, in a sense, which I think maps to a lot of the issues the United States is having right now.
Nice one. I'll go first on this, and then you can as well. But is there something astrologically that specifically speaks to coronavirus for the rest of the year? Well, for me, there's two answers. No is one answer, in the sense that I think it attaches to Saturn in Aquarius, which means I think it's a end of next year. I think it's a 2021 story. That said, as we were just discussing, there's the late August, early September shit show, which from that's kind of like the March shit, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a it's a very so it's not like we have years of data, right, for this event, this set of events, but if we're looking for the coronavirus being a thing that was Saturn right next to Pluto activated by Mars, we get that again in September.
Yeah, cool. Any more major themes on the new eclipse axis? That's a good one.
So in general, it's actually less gnarly than the eclipses we've been doing. As I've said several times, where you really get problems is when you have difficult things that are stacking on top of each other. And for the last 2-ish years, we've had the eclipses stacking on top of Saturn and Pluto, right? And so this new set of eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius, it's just there. They're not stacking on slow moving malefics like Saturn or Pluto. Now, that said, if we want to focus on America, the United States, if you use the Sibley chart, which I tend to prefer, has Sagittarius rising and has Mars and Uranus in Gemini. And so this set of eclipses is probably worse for the US chart, but in general and for individuals, it's not as stacked. It's not as malefically stacked.
Related in a way, and a way it's exactly related. Question from Jeff about the upcoming eclipse. When it occurs on top of one's natal sun placement, it's a bad thing. If someone were to have this is close to, and I'm only allowing it because of my chart, we don't generally do like actual charts. Well, you don't do actual chart questions because we'd be here forever. But the question is essentially natal sun 27 Gemini. Is that a bad eclipse, or is it because it's in another sign but nearby, it's not going to be as shit? What do you reckon? So Jeff's got it near his natal sun, but in a different sign. And I'm interested in that answer because, yo. All right. You keep talking, but you went silent from me again. So I'm going to leave and come back.
Getting the right framework around eclipses is difficult, which makes sense because they're literally obscurations of what is supposed to be easy to see, right? Full moons are supposed to be very visible. The sun is supposed to be visible during the day.
Apparently, sorry to interrupt, Austin. Apparently you went silent for a bunch of people. So do you want to start
apparently apparently I went out too.
Yeah, there you go. All right. So for James who's listening, can you send me the remaining questions again? Because obviously my questions have vanished. But carry on, Austin. Oh, it's gone silent again. You've gone again. Unbelievable. All right. Can anyone hear me while Austin comes and goes? Like, am I visible at the moment? Invisible. Am I audible at the moment? Anyone in the chat? I said I can be heard and Austin can't. So what we might do is I'm gonna steal host back and you leave. So I'm the hostess with the mostess again. So Austin, if you want to like fuck off and come back, well, this hasn't happened before. That's what he said. Ciao. See you in a bit. All right, let me open up, see if there are any questions I can answer about astrology. Let's do it, hey? James, that would have been better sent not as a Google Doc, to be frank. Just pasted in the email would have been fine. Yeah, it's Mercury. It's what happens. This is like the best of it. And the reason I was joking, well, the reason why we had Jeff's question about eclipses on someone's natal sun is this one. I wasn't joking about hiding under a pile of coats playing the rosary. Like, this one is not good space weather for me in particular. Speak about you expect. No, I just did. All right. Oh, someone's dropped another question in, because, yeah, James, can you just send that as an email? It's not actually even low. Oh, there we go. Given that 2020 is a trap, what do you think the angels may have to do with making traps or relieving us from them? To be honest, both, right? Like, if you look at the Avenging Angels presentation or discussion with the Scarlets that I did earlier in the year in London, you're dealing with a word that covers a tremendous amount of extra-dimensional ambiguity. So it's not just, whilst there are planetary angels and indeed angels of different zodiacal signs and all the rest of it, they won't line up. They won't line up into useful or not useful. It's way more complicated and interesting than that. Austin, I think I heard you breathing. Are you back,
Maybe.
sir?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
All right, great.
Okay. Well, that's a difficult one to sort of answer. How do we focus on 2035? I never said that exactly, and not get bogged down in 2020 to 2022. I would say that's a maturity that comes with enough time cycle or star watching, and it's part of it is to not be distracted by the short term, and it's to go on a news diet and do all of that kind of stuff, right? It's to kind of take your own integrity and focus very, very seriously, because there's always going to be some kind of weather. On the one hand, it's just weather. On the other hand, it's really, really bad. So adjust to the conditions and make sure, this is what the wealth course is for as well. Make sure that you kind of know, make sure you are heading in the approximate trajectory of where you want to be, and where you want to be is a personal question, I think. Anything else, Austin?
Oh, I kind of came in at the end of that question.
Okay.
I like that because that was one of the things that I've been thinking about. This 2020 is so dramatic that it's really distracting, right? Like it does have that car crash attention grabbing energy, and there's certainly some things you shouldn't not pay attention to, but in terms of an individual person's attention economy, right? Like you still have a medium, there's still like a medium term plan or direction in place. Like you're still going to be here and have to pay bills and have to deal with physical health and mental health and personal relationships in 2021 and 22 and 23 and 24, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is a question there that I think has some general answers, like you were saying, but also the right answers, just like dietary answers, always have to be tailored to a certain degree.
Yeah.
And I like what you said about a media or news diet, right, which is different than a fast, right? A fast is a stopgap measure when things are, you do that for a little bit because you're super toxified or whatever. But what is sustainable is a diet, right?
Yes.
Like eating the nutritious bits, but not gorging yourself on anything that's available.
So West asks, what are we calling H2? And they proposed the Cardinal Crunch, but I was just going to call it This Is Fine. Like, I think it could just be the meme.
I mean, I told you, I've been going personally, I think of it as the wood chipper. But I like Cardinal Crunch. This is fine.
Yeah. So there's another solar eclipse occurs on my birthday. Is shopping for gently used coffins on Craigslist in order? Kind of. Or you can do mine. It's not quite on the birthday, but like hide under a pile of coats and pray the rosary. And also freak
I
everyone else around you talking about what happens to your stuff once you die.
Yeah, I don't know. I would probably shop for like cool toy dragons rather than coffins for an eclipse.
There's a number of questions which again do need to be individually tailored to, so like this is not medical, astromedical advice in a sense, but there's a number of questions pertaining to Mars remediation in general, or whether it's beneficial or so on. And because of where it is in my chart, mine is to do with things like reducing inflammation, hence dry July, and having a diversion drain for it in increasing cardio. So
Mhm.
that's mine, but I can't necessarily say that for everyone. But are there any universals you would, or where people should look to start with for that?
It's, I would say with Mars, it is a little trickier than with a lot of other planets because Mars is, is the gasoline, right? And so ignoring it means like gas pooling up, right, in a corner. Just being wild with it is things being on fire. And so Mars requires a particular form of care and thoughtfulness. You can't just like control or release, right? On a psychological level, Mars is like aggression and competition, right? If when you just try to bottle that up for people, it explodes out in weird ways. But if you encourage it in an unrestrained manner, that is also a disaster, right? And so Mars, like that, I would say that's the framing for Mars, and keeping it in that happy space, right, where you wake up and your body is excited to run around and do stuff, but you're not like aggro and having roid rage, or you haven't suppressed the internal fire to the degree that everything seems too hard and you have no fight left in you, right?
Yeah.
And so just taking a look at your baseline outside of whatever the chart may or may not say, but like, oh, am I generally too aggro? Then I'm definitely going to need to have some tone it down as part of my schedule. Here, do I have a harder time getting and going? Do I shy away from competitions? Do I have a hard time getting fired up about things, et cetera, et cetera? Well, then this extra gasoline rain may actually be useful for you. But just watching sort of what direction you're trending towards, and figuring out how to bring that back to not neutral, but how should we say, but balance is
Yeah.
really the key.
And I managed on a personal, because it's obviously health stuff, in my chat in particular, to get the Australian ayahuasca retreats in just before like late August, early September. So I'm going to be maximal health for when that shit show happens. So you can do things like that. Again, that's me specific, but this is why we do the halves, right? So you can begin some of the longer term things that might be useful, whatever the weather happens to be. April is a good one. Is any of this amplifying mind control? Seems lots have lost their damn minds. And yes, so for me, if you look at the data control grid Aquarian energy that's coming, which is like that, if you look at like Aquarian capacity for delusion or hallucination, that's in there. So yes, simply put, that will be tied to like action in and around Aquarius for me, because it is digital based mind control. That doesn't explain all of it. Like, this is what's so good about omen logic and astrological models, is the moment picks the things. Like, you don't, and that's a much more healthy and tactical and useful way of being in the world. So yes, I think we're seeing some of it, and I expect to see more of it. The other thing, as we were going through, that occurred to me for 2021, Jupiter in Aquarius, if one of the themes of stuff in Aquarius is to do with data and control, that speaks to the education system doing the same thing, engineering out cost and essentially permanentizing, particularly at a higher education level, the way it's being delivered digitally. So the opportunities for mind control are rife in the medium term, and that's just a thing we have to navigate.
Yeah, I'd say that's a given.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to say back to Mars really quickly is we've been talking a lot about Mars as it is either enacted or experienced on a health level. So in or socially, a lot of the times you'll also just see, and this is what I'm expecting for me because of the house and all that, the house position of the transit, is a lot of times Mars will just try to make you way fucking busier than is healthy for you. And so one way to do that is is not to abandon whatever your chosen profession is for months, but to not overcommit, to be very aware that this period of time wants to run me into the fucking dirt, and to not to at least not help it along by getting really excited about how much you think you're going to be able to do in 2 months.
Yeah, I like that.
And then what's interesting is that pacing thing creates the health things that we associate with Mars, right? And it also creates the being short-tempered things that we associate with the social enactment of Mars.
I like that. I'm personally going to take that on board, because that works for me too.
Not that you've ever overworked yourself.
Imagine that. Yeah, perish the thought. April has one which comes up every time, but might as well say it. There's often differing points of view on doing magic during the eclipses. What would you both recommend for the Sag Gemini series? Well, April, there isn't differing opinions on doing magic during the eclipses. There is the correct answer and the incorrect answer. Cool. Carla's got, I know this is for 2021, but Armstrong plague cycle peaks then. It peaks 2021, 2022. So like Northern Hemisphere winter.
Mm-hmm.
Will that be tied to planetary configurations of this year? Everything's in
Not
flow.
of this year.
Yeah, but yeah.
I personally think that if we're going to get like big, like plague as big as people thought we were going to get earlier this year, I think that's going to be the next eclipse cycle. So this one is Gem and Sag, and then it moves over into Taurus and Scorpio. And so we'll get eclipses on top of that Uranus and Taurus while it's still squaring Saturn. That's 22. I think that it, like big disruptions like that like, I don't know, that could be big weather stuff, that could be food supply stuff, that could be plague stuff. That's the eclipses doubling down on something already there. And if we were looking for like a bigger disease event, I would say that would probably, I'd be surprised if that didn't.
Right. That's so weird. So instead of your sound just like clicking off, it gradually faded and went up and down. So try and say something else. We'll see if you're back yet.
Test.
It's quiet. You sound like small man in a box. That's.
What about now? Can you hear me now?
It's louder now.
Okay, I switched mics.
Okay, that'll do.
All right, I just switched mics. We'll just do this one for the end.
So do you think a Shadowrun cyberpunk future is possible, or is it drifting into Blade Runner? No, I think cyberpunk, Blade Runner is cyberpunk, but I think it's going to be more gloriously cyberpunk. And this is a good example of it. So we're using surveilled technology created by the guy who runs the company, who runs Zoom, says he will collaborate and corroborate with law enforcement. This is all being recorded for whoever, and it's not working very well. But we are discussing digital and non-digital ways of being in a challenging future. So I think this is it, right? Yeah.
I mean, we're literally talking about divinatory models, fortune telling, and magic on a digital platform. Like this is Shadowrun. Right?
Yes,
this is the Shadowrun timeline.
So is there a chance of war at this point? Again, yes. Like if you mean at this point in H2, yeah, there is. And it's a question of how you define it, right? Like if you look at the damage that's going on in US cities or has just been on, like what do we call that? When and in particular with the sort of last 40 years of neoliberal policy, when is the US in particular not been at war? But if you mean like, is there the possibility of it getting hotter? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when people say war, I feel like a lot of times they mean great power war, right? Like
Yeah.
US versus Russia, India versus China. And I would say no. But like, as you pointed out, like, when has the US not been at war over the last 19 years, right? When
Yes.
have there not been like active duty troops with live firearms? So, there's that. And in terms of proxy wars, right, those have been pretty constant for a while now. And so that's sort of where the war energy goes at this point, for this last while. I don't think we're going to pop over to great power war. And in terms of, like, we're definitely going to have a heating of, obviously, of conflicts in the United States over this next 6 months. I don't think that looks like anything like a full-on civil war. The recurrence transit for the civil war for the United States, which I don't think is going to be, blue and gray lined up on a battlefield, but will have a much more meaningful resemblance. That's the second half of this decade.
Yeah.
That's the Uranus and Gemini. That's, if we're looking for like things getting as polar, if we're looking for the United States achieving maximum polarization, which we've been on track for a while, Uranus and Gemini, which is like 25 to 32, that's where that's located.
Yeah.
And then we could probably figure out easier with smaller cycles which pieces of that are likely to be hottest.
This one, the last few months have been rather optimistic in terms of the economy and the market are going to recover swiftly and life will go back to normal despite all the terrible data that's coming out. Is the space where they're creating an illusion that things are all right? Or does it look like we are going to get beaten down again? The severe economic contraction lasts for years and it has not hit yet. Spain had a youth unemployment rate of 40% before going into this. If you think developed economies, if you think it's going to return to any kind of semblance of what we had before, it's not. It's just terrible. And the thing is that doesn't even need to track to like a long-term space where the story, the hits that we got in H1 have caused that damage. We just haven't lived through enough of it yet. But economically, it's not good. There is no V-shaped recovery. There is no V-shaped recovery.
And I've talked about that on some podcasts recently. I think that one of the things we'll look at for the Venus retrograde, which is over by the end of this month, is that part of so with Venus, Mercury, with Venus, and then we have the retrograde. Sometimes we get things that look like they're going to be great or look like they're going to be fine, but they're not during Venus retrogrades. And so I think that that was one of the reasons I thought that that we are doing a dead cat bounce. And again, we get kind of two general shit show delivery points over the next 6 months. One is just in a couple weeks. And then the second one, which I think is harder, is in September. And I think that in addition to intersecting with other areas, those will have primary economic significations. The metaphor I've used before, which is a little intense, but I'm comfortable with, is, and this comes from rewatching Terminator 2 recently, there's like, let's say, there's a nuclear weapon lands 40 miles away and you see the flash of light, it burns your skin, and then like count down until the shock wave hits, right, and blows all the buildings down. And so I think we have two shock waves, and I think that's like early July-ish and then September.
Yeah.
And then let's see where we are after the shock waves hit, rather than being like, wow, that light sure was bright, my eyes hurt. Because I think that's kind of where we are right now.
And in the US, so the sort of emergency funding, because Washington managed to put through, they had the time and money to bail out literally corporate lobbyists, but the emergency money that goes to people who actually need it runs out in July. So the next kind of farce that will be Washington pretending to help while giving lots of money to their friends will get us. So that's July. And then it's another 3 months because these emergency packages come in 3 months. And that one, I think where we're looking at it from the space weather is what you were just saying, like there's going to be some like abrupt and alarming hits, weirdly tangential, but kind of like, go.
Okay, so just quick jump in on that. So I think we get a blast wave, let's say early July. I think that there's another aid package, which is like 1 for you, 25 for me, right? And then that's why like end of July, August looks calmer from the astro. Is people are like, yeah, let's pretend this is totally going to work, and then we get the September shockwave, and things don't look calm for a while after that.
Yeah, so that's for your H2 planning. That's really useful, and that ties with what we can expect or have come to expect of Washington in general, but certainly over the last 4 years. There's been a couple of property questions, and it's sort of like best time to move or buy property. But I want to maybe modify it because there's been about 2 or 3 of them now that I've got several documents open, which is where should someone look in their own chart for that? Where should someone, because a lot of people are trying to move to different areas or growing areas or whatever. Where should people be looking in H2 for if there's if it is favored or not?
So this is going to sound kind of condescending, but I mean this I mean this to be helpful. If you need to ask that, then you shouldn't be the one doing the astrology and making big decisions based on that. If you're learning, and this is just a question, you want to start, you always want to start with the 4th house, and the ruler of the 4th, planets transiting the 4th, or this activated. You start with the 4th house, also consider the moon. But that's something that it's probably going to take more than 6 months to get good at. And so if that's a really pressing question, I would go I would go see someone. And I also think that a lot of times astrology, I've noticed that astrology is much better at saying when a person is probably going to move, right, than it is at saying and New Zealand or Vermont or whatever, that's the right place to go. Astrology has, even though there are some things which can kind of give information about different locations, I think that's a really easy really easy question for cards to answer. Like somebody can just throw cards through, be like, yeah, what about the Vermont? What does that angle look like? What does New Zealand look like? What does Texas look like? Like tarot can give you really strong, judgy answers, which will be useful about all those questions.
And if it is something like it's a big deal where you choose to live, so yes, go and see someone, an astrologer, with exactly that. But also, if you find the right place, you found the right place, and you use astrology to deal with, and magic in general, to make that as friction-free a process in existence as possible, right? So as for like, this is a really good time or whatever to buy or shop, there are longer and more alarming headwinds. So what's going to happen property-wise over the next 18 months is as the sovereign debt crisis increases, so will interest rates from where they are now. And that means that property prices are going to dramatically depreciate, but getting a mortgage is going to be harder. So there's this moment of kind of like, you'll have to jump at some point. Prices are declining, although not in rural areas that can grow their own food, but like there's a end of Titanic moment that you're going to need to make a jump on it. And it's just generally speaking, way too complicated for, as you say, like just saying September or whatever.
Yeah.
You go. I'm going to find more questions. They're spread out all over the place.
There was just one statement in the chat that I really liked. Let me grab it. Okay. Moving, astro for when, tarot for where, and magic for how.
That's cute. I like it.
That's pretty darn good. That's Caleb McCoy.
Yeah, I like it. So, Robert, as you both seem to hint, the upcoming election may end in historically unprecedented way. Is there anything in the stars to suggest there may be less stars on the flag as a result of this? That trend is in play. I don't know how quickly it happens, but this year, this is kind of like 2020 is the trap or preview. The voices being loud for haven't been this loud for secession ever, and they haven't been as bipartisan. So, you know, Texas always talks about it. California doesn't make explicit reference to itself as a separate country, and it did in H1. So yes, this trend is in play. There will be fewer stars on the flag between now and the end of the decade. But as to where and when, and that's useful coming back, you know.
That's a Uranus and Gemini topic. That's absolutely, that's when that trend peaks and we see what fruit is born, bitter, sweet, and otherwise.
Yeah. Shannon had one. This is cool. One of the reasons I signed up for my current Master of Fine Arts was listening to the H2 podcast a couple of years ago and mentioning that Uranus in Taurus times when new art movements are established. 2 years down the line, I'm working on my final project, but with no graduate show, and the erasure of the kind of liminal support that assists with the onboarding through the professional paid studio residences, seminars, etc. Is there anything else coming on the H2 timeline that would be auspicious, inauspicious, noteworthy regarding the arts or making art in general, or seeking to establish yourself in such a realm? This is a longer term question again. Do not count on governments, like whatever your strategy is, do not make it applying for local government arts grants, because that's not the game anymore. And that wouldn't be very Uranus and Taurus as it is. So it's not good news on the front of kind of like having established structures for it. But the good news is that the market in the cosmic sense needs new art and new ideas and whatever now. And a whole bunch of professional and mainstream media is collapsing before our very eyes. So the opportunity is there. And the trouble is when you go and do something like a fucking MFA or any kind of arts degree, all you are taught to do really is to like go down the government funded path. I certainly was in my film degree. Like when I did the production component, all we learned was like, this is Screen Time Australia. This is how New South Wales funds its films. This is the federal funding. And so you just learned how to fill out grants, and you would, and no one became a filmmaker doing that. So that's all I would say. Like, keep your eye on the longer trends. The Uranian Taurian energy that does create new art movements also disrupts the stability of pleasure, right? So the predictability of arts as institutions.
Yeah.
Do we get a tanker war this year? Arguably, maybe, but arguably what Pompeo in particular is doing is achieving the same thing. Remember that the tanker war's design for, why a tanker war benefited the US was to onshore manufacturing steps back into the US from China, which has been the game of, the Trump administration from the very beginning. But this entire narrative at the moment is accomplishing it without a tanker war. So it may happen, but the effects are there. The sort of onboarding back into the Americas is accelerating. This is kind of, probably not, will the Merc retro in Scorpio this year reveal the economic issues? You always get some kind of like spy-based disclosures when something like that happens, but the economic issues aren't hidden. It's just
I think there will be front page news a month and a half before Mercury stations retrograde, or let's say a solid month before Mercury stations retrograde. If they weren't, Mercury retrogrades can have this quality of retrieving lost but relevant information. If that information was somehow lost or people weren't aware of that, then it would have that function. But I think that will be absurdly visible at that point.
Yes. There was a good one. Oh, we didn't actually speak about this, but any thoughts on natural disasters until the end of the year? And obviously Mars in Aries speaks to one in particular.
I'm a little concerned about having a Mars and Aries summer here, because there's fire up here. Last couple of years, last year wasn't so bad, but the 2 years before that, we had smoke. You could smell smoke outside for 6 weeks at a time. That's part of that's natural, part of that's mismanagement. Regardless, it's still an issue if you live in this part of the country. So I've actually been kind of going back and forth. I'm like, maybe that square to Saturn will actually, even though it's generally not good for the humans, maybe that'll keep keep things from getting too hot and scorchy up here. But that kind of malefics tightly configured to each other thing, that can spin out depending on where it falls in a national chart and an ingress chart and all that. That can signify any manner of unpleasant thing, economic, disease, fire, flood, wind. It's the two bads that go bad together in terms of this kind of mundane astrology. So there'll probably be something bad that happens naturally while there's a lot of human bad happening at the same time.
Jules' question: when does it look like travel might open up? Speaking of Mercury, but honestly, Saturn in Aquarius, he's not really much for the travel, but we're talking about imprisonment and not imprisonment, unless there's something you can think of in the shorter Mercury cycles. What does it look like to you?
So I think the biggest single indicator for people not being able to travel and not being able to get together has been Jupiter sort of temporarily offline and off the table in 2020. One of the sort of basic, some of the basic thinking about Jupiter from a Vedic astrology angle that I really like, that I think is really valuable and relevant here, is Jupiter is seen as bringing not one of the four traditional elements, but bringing the sort of meta element of space, right? Jupiter makes enough room to fill with all the other elemental states. And in there's a sort of electional or moment picking tradition where you want to make sure Jupiter is good whenever you want to get a lot of people together, because you have to make space, you have to make a space that can hold a bunch of people and bring them together. And so one of the things that's been really obvious about this year is all these normal things that get people together to do a thing, whether it's let's get together and watch a basketball game or let's get together and do a conference, that's all just been wiped off the board. And that's that Jupiter being temporarily offline. So I would say Jupiter comes back online at, let's say, 45% capacity at the end of the year when it goes into Aquarius. And then we do get this nice early ingress of Jupiter into Pisces during Q2 of 2021, which is when I would expect there to be some actual, yay, we can really get back, there was enough time to plan to get together again then.
Nice. April could this be the tide that truly overturns white supremacy? Will BLM gain necessary momentum? So white supremacy is empire. So what you're experiencing is the longer move from an earth triplicity to the air ones. What Austin and I talk about the whole time. So the short answer is yes. Well, the short answer is no. The long answer is yes. What you were feeling is the end of that cosmic process, right? So what people describe as white supremacy is honestly is quite literally that land-based, expansive, I claim this thinking coming to an end. So the good and the bad news is yes, we're not out of the triplicity yet. So, and we move into another one. It doesn't mean utopia arrives. It just means tyranny and other things are configured differently, or the sort of story of power is configured differently.
Yeah, I'd say we're moving in that, what seemed like gains moving in that direction are not illusory.
Yes.
Right? It's not like that's not over next month, right? But that it's not just like a moment of excitement, right? There is legitimate historical momentum in that direction, which is great.
Yeah. To answer Shanon's question about art stuff again, anything else in the H2 timeline that would be auspicious or noteworthy regarding arts or making art or seeking to establish yourself in such a realm? I would wait until Jupiter enters December. Shannon, aim for like that kind of stuff at the end of the year. This is a really bad half of you. Simple as that.
Well, and so one of the things that one of the things I've been thinking about is, during any particular state of affairs, any arrangement of forces, any environment, there are going to be things that work better and worse. And as I was complaining to myself about having to try to explain this stuff and talk about it publicly, it's less fun. It's like less fun than talking about astrology has been for most of my life. It might be equally valuable, it might be more valuable, but it's less fun. And in general, there's a lot of like, oh, I don't want to be part of the public conversation. It seems like that's not even going anywhere. Like if we're talking about investing our attention and energy, there's something to be said for like, this is not an isolationist bunker strategy, but I've been thinking like, well, what do I want to do with the rest of my year other than what I've already committed to do? And it's like, well, maybe just like sitting down and working on those books that you've been procrastinating for a couple of years. Like, maybe it's not time to like run around, and it's clearly not time to like plan a live event for October this year, and we're not doing As Above 2 in September, right? And so it's like, well, but what can I do? It's like, well, what is not necessarily especially auspicious, but what parts of life, what areas of activity are not at all shat upon by the bad weather, right? And something like writing, for example, for me, when I think of art projects, I think of writing a book, right? That's not capital intensive, it is energy intensive. And so it's like, do I need anything from the environment outside of my room to do that? Do I need there to be a calm political climate? Do I need the economy to be booming? Like, no. And so, like that sort of create while the shitstorms are passing is maybe not a bad angle. As far as when to release a project, I would hold on to that until at least Q1 next year. But most projects take a lot of time, even if they're not novels or whatever.
All right. A lot of these are sort of similar ones, and we do need to draw it to a close at some stage. We did a couple of hours of all the rest of it. There's one that's sort of like, what is your best advice for the rest of the year? And I think you actually just landed on it, which is, what I like about having 6 monthly shows is it's enough time to address things tactically, looking at what's happening. And you had a very good one. That was a really good answer. Because we're not doing, I thought the next one needs to be called See Above. Something really passive aggressive. So below, as above. Next one's like See Above, or as further above, or as previously stated. Just to
That's
go
really
from,
funny.
Yeah, See Above. But that's not happening this year. All right. Is there anything else we're going to leave people with? There's a bunch of questions, but they're sort of getting a little bit to. Some of them are more travel ones and so on. Anything else? Any other final notes? What else have you got coming up? Final notes and what you got coming up.
I will be continuing to teach my yearly classes. We're in halfway through month 3. Got another 4.5 to go. Or 5 actually. I don't know, I'm just kind of doing my thing. Phases 2 should be out in August. We're just about there.
Very good.
No promises. It'll be there when it's there, but right now fully on track for that. That'll be exciting. It'll be exciting simply because it won't be hanging over my head anymore. It'll be one less thing to feel guilty and behind about.
That's been a real challenge with this year is it's the inflation thing. So one of the ways inflation shows up is unreliability. So it shows up because you have reduced productivity because of unreliability. So I'm behind on a whole bunch of stuff as well, and farm stuff and book stuff and whatever, because there are things you just can't do. 2020 is one of those years where you can't plan. You can't rely on reliability. And so yes, we certainly won't hold you to it. Looking forward to it if August is indeed the case for Handsome Faces the sequel, or Handsome Faces the Handsoming
2.0
update.
Yeah. Oh, and it's not mostly me, but there were actually a few choice moments hidden among the various storms of misfortune earlier this year that we caught for Spear and Sundry. And so Kate has a couple very nice series in the can that will be released at various points throughout the year. And I'm excited about it. I'm so glad I'm so glad we caught those moments, because there were a few really, really nice weekends or days in the middle of what from a distance just looked like a rough time, and the overall story was, but we caught a few of these, like, I don't know, like almost like when the clouds break and a big beam of sunlight just comes down, you're like, oh, that's even nicer because of the context.
Yeah, I like it. And it's good to have, bottled good times for the bad times. So yay. All right, well, that was H2, aka This Is Fine. So yeah, thanks very much. I think this is going to be the most intense one we'll ever do in a lot of ways. So everyone be nice to each other, particularly with Mars stomping all up and down Aries for the next 6 months. It's not a time to beef, I don't think. And yeah, thanks for the questions, and apologies for the inevitable technical difficulties, everyone. But see you in 6 months.
All right. Take care, everybody.